All right, let's go. Number 10. The Cattle of Nabta Playa. Fred Wendorf and Romuald Schild spent close to 30 years excavating a dry basin in the Egyptian Sahara, 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel and about the same distance from the Nile. It is kidney-shaped, some 10 kilometers by 7. There is nothing in it now. No water, no grass, no people. Along the west bank of an old wadi, their expedition found a line of low stone mounds, 3 to 5 meters across, built out of broken sandstone blocks. Under one of them was a cow. She had been laid on her left side in a pit, spine running north to south, head facing south. The pit was lined with clay and roofed before the stones went on top. She was a young adult female. She had not been butchered. 15 of these mounds have been found in that wadi, and 9 of them opened. The rest held cattle bone, broken and scattered among the rocks. The reason anyone built them starts with the fact that the Sahara used to be wet. Around 11,000 years ago, the summer monsoon pushed north into what is now the eastern desert, and the country filled with seasonal lakes, grass, gazelle, hare, and people. Nabta Playa was one of those lakes, and the settlements on its floor had huts in rows and wells sunk into the sediment, one of them 2.5 meters deep. Then the rain went away again. How fast is one of the longest-running arguments in African paleoclimate. A Marine Corps off Mauritania pointed to an abrupt collapse about 5,500 years ago, and that is where the popular version comes from. Work at Lake Yoa in Chad found the opposite, a slow drying, running from 6,000 years ago down to 4,300. The compromise now is that the end was locally fast and regionally staggered. Wherever a family happened to be standing, the water left inside a lifetime. That is the world these mounds were built in, and it is what makes the buried cow more than a curiosity. A young adult female is the most valuable animal a herding household owns. She is not meat, she is milk, and calves, and every calf those calves will ever have. Burying her whole is not a feast. It is not a funeral either. It is the deliberate destruction of the herd's future, in a landscape where the herd was the only thing between a family and nothing. That is the unsettling part. The offering had to cost something, or it was not an offering. There is more in that basin than the mounds. About 30 megalithic structures cluster in the largest group. In 1998, the astronomer McKim Malville published their alignments in Nature with Wendorf and Schild, arguing for orientations to the cardinal points and the solstices. The limits there are severe. No stone at Nabta Playa has ever been directly dated, and none of the primary papers offers a statistical test of the alignments. The cow has one radiocarbon measurement, taken on tamarisk wood from the chamber roof, 6,480 years before the present, give or take 270. That error swings her burial across more than 1,000 years, which means the story everybody tells about her, that she was killed as the rain began to fail, cannot be tested against the drought. It can only be reasoned toward. Savino de Lernia published the reasoning in Quaternary International in 2006, reading monument building and cattle ritual across the Holocene Sahara as a response to rapid environmental change. Augustin Hall offered a different one in 2020. On his reading, the burials answered disease in the herds, and the most skeptical assessment notes that these deposits hold sheep and goat as well as cattle, added one animal at a time. That is not strong evidence for a cult of anything. Nobody was sacrificed at Nabta Playa. The human graves there are ordinary. What was given up was livestock, by people who were running out of water, and who then walked away from the basin. The mounds still stand on the bank of a wadi that has not carried water in 5,000 years. Whatever they were meant to prevent arrived anyway. Number 9. The pits at Sanxingdui. In 1986, workers digging clay for a brickyard in Guanghan, in Sichuan, cut into a rectangular pit packed with bronze. A second pit appeared that August, 20 to 30 meters from the first. Between them, they held roughly 400 objects in one and well over 1,000 in the other. 13 elephant tusks in the first pit, 67 in the second, around 4,500 cowrie shells. More than 100 nearly life-size bronze heads, at least 6 still wearing masks of hammered gold. A standing bronze figure 2.5 meters tall, counting its pedestal. There was also a bronze tree. Restored, it stands 3 meters 96 and weighs over 800 kilograms, and the original was probably close to 5 meters. At least 8 of these trees are now known. Nobody can say what they represent. Nobody at Sanxingdui left any writing. Every object in those pits had been destroyed first. That is the detail that turns 2 rich deposits into a ritual. The bronzes were broken. The jades were broken before they went in, and the fragments were scattered through the fill. The tusks were burnt. Pit 1 also held more than 3 cubic meters of burnt and broken animal bone, which is an extraordinary quantity of slaughtered livestock to render down to charcoal in one operation. 6 more pits were located in 2019 and excavated between 2020 and 2022 by the Sichuan Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology, with teams from Peking University and Sichuan University. By the middle of 2022, the new pits had given up around 13,000 objects. 7 of the 8 contained a layer of burnt elephant tusk, and over 700 tusks have now come out of that ground. A gold mask from Pit 5 survives as roughly half a mask and weighs 280 grams. The chronology is reasonably firm. 6 bamboo charcoal samples from the ash layer of Pit 4 were dated by accelerator mass spectrometry at Peking University and modeled in 2021, and the result was 1199 to 1017 BC at 95% probability. That is the late Shang period, contemporary with the Oracle Bone Kings at Anyang, 1,100 kilometers northeast, whose art and religion look nothing like this. But here's where the chemistry changes what kind of ceremony this was. In 2023, a team from the Chengdu University of Technology measured the color and the magnetic properties of the pit sediments and the objects in them. They put the burning temperature at 600 to 800 degrees Celsius. They also established something nobody expected. The burning did not happen in the pits. The material was burnt somewhere else, and then carried in, ash and all, and a second study using soil micromorphology confirmed that finding in 2025. So the sequence runs in 2 stages. First a fire, somewhere off-site, hot enough to bleach jade and carbonize ivory. Into it went the images, the trees, the masks, the tusks and the herds. Then a set of pits, dug and filled deliberately, with the large bronzes placed in the upper layers above the smaller fragments. That is not looting, and it is not panic. Somebody was tidy about it. What went into the fire is the thing to hold on to. Not surplus, not tribute, not grave goods for a named king, because no human remains have ever been found in any of these pits. What was destroyed was the entire visible apparatus of a religion, the faces of its gods, the trees that held its world together, the scepters, the eyes, the masks. In September 2025, the excavation team announced that fragments of single objects had been matched across 6 of the pits. If that holds, all of it went into the ground in one event. Popular accounts have this civilization drowned by a great flood. The geology does not support it. The paleofluid deposits on the Chengdu Plain are 4 to 8 centuries too early. The earthquake argument, a landslide diverting the Minjiang River away from the city, is circumstantial, and it would explain an abandonment. It does not explain a bonfire. Sanxingdui was a walled center of about 3.5 square kilometers. 40 kilometers away, at Jinsha, gold and jade of the same tradition appear as this place fades. The bronzes are in museum cases now, reassembled, with the break lines showing. We have their gods. We have no idea what they were called. Number 8. The tophet at Carthage. In 1921, 2 men named Paul Gielli and Francois Icard bought a carved limestone slab from illegal diggers outside Tunis. It showed a Punic priest carrying a child. They bought the land it had come from and dug it themselves, and what they uncovered was a walled enclosure of 6,000 square meters, in continuous use for 6 centuries, filled with buried pottery urns. Each urn held ash and burnt bone. Above them stood carved stones, more than 6,000 of them inscribed in Phoenician, addressed to the god Baal-Hamon and the goddess Tanit. The site is usually credited with around 20,000 urns. That number is an extrapolation. The only sealed and published sample is 445 urns, lifted by an American project between 1976 and 1979 out of roughly 30 cubic meters of soil. What was inside them is not disputed. 323 held human remains, almost all newborns or infants. 59 held animals only. About a quarter held both, an infant and a lamb burnt together on the same fire. The lambs were 1 to 3 months old. That puts the burning at lambing, in late winter or spring. What makes this the strangest entry on the list is that specialists cannot agree on whether anyone was killed here at all. In 2010, Jeffrey Schwartz of the University of Pittsburgh published an analysis of 348 urns and 540 individuals. He used tooth formation stages in the neonatal line, a mark laid down in enamel at the moment of birth. About a fifth of his sample came out as prenatal, and 26 specimens had no neonatal line at all, meaning stillbirth or death within days. His conclusion was blunt. This was a cemetery for infants who had died on their own. The rebuttal came from Patricia Smith at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, working with the Harvard archaeologists Joseph Green and Lawrence Steger. It turned on one measurable thing. Cremation shrinks teeth, and it does not shrink them evenly. A developing tooth loses roughly 0.6 of a millimeter in the fire. That is 6 weeks of growth. Schwartz had assumed developing enamel does not shrink, and Smith showed that enamel stays only 30 to 60% mineralized until the crown is nearly finished, which leaves enough soft matrix to shrink badly. Correct for that, and the ages move. Her distribution peaks at 1 to 1.5 months. That is not an ordinary cemetery. Then a group of Phoenician specialists, led by Paolo Sella, made an argument with no bones in it. The inscriptions above these urns are votive, not funerary. They use the language of vows. One recurring phrase means offering of a lamb, and the identical construction appears with the word for a human being. Grammatically, the two cannot mean different things. One of them can only mean a sheep. The literary sources are hostile, and most of them are late. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC about a siege of 310 BC, describes 200 children of noble families sacrificed publicly during the emergency, and not fewer than 300 more offered by families suspected of dodging the levy. He also describes a bronze image of the god with sloping hands, from which each child rolled into a pit of fire. That detail recurs almost word for word in other authors, which usually marks a shared story rather than independent observation. But throwing all of it out is weak too. 2 of these sources are roughly contemporary with the practice. Something quieter cuts against the picture of industrial slaughter. At the tophet of Motia, in Sicily, the deposition rate across 4 centuries works out to 1 or 2 urns a year. And nobody has published a study showing that burials at Carthage spiked during a war or a siege. The visible trend tracks the growth of the city, and the lambs suggest a calendar rather than a crisis, which leaves an honest and uncomfortable middle. Dead infants and young lambs were burnt here and dedicated to 2 gods over 6 centuries, and the stones above them record what was promised and what was handed over. Most of the children in that ground appear to have died on their own. Whether some of them did not is unresolved. If most of these infants died in their cots, what were their parents paying for? There is one more piece, and it comes from Algeria. 5 stelae, found in 1930, Roman in date, carved centuries after Carthage was destroyed. They are inscribed in Latin to Saturn, and they carry a formula: soul for soul, blood for blood, life for life. Some add a lamb as substitute. Whatever was offered on that ground, the idea that a life could be paid for with another life outlived the city by 300 years. Number 7. The bones that asked for rain. It is the shoulder blade of an ox, scraped flat and polished, with rows of shallow hollows chiseled into the reverse. A heated rod goes into one of the hollows. On the other side, the bone splits along a hairline crack that nobody can control. A diviner reads it. Then, a scribe cuts the question into the surface beside the crack. And sometimes, later, what actually happened. They were being sold in Chinese pharmacies as dragon bones when a scholar named Wang Yirong recognized the marks as writing in 1899. The source turned out to be Anyang in Henan, the last capital of the Shang dynasty, occupied from about 1250 to 1046 BC. Between 150,000 and 200,000 inscribed pieces are now known, though only a fraction came out of controlled excavation. They carry around 1,200 distinct characters. About half have been deciphered. This is the oldest body of writing in East Asia, and a great deal of it is about the weather. Will Dai order rain sufficient for the harvest? Will Dai order rain in the 4th month? It is Dai who is harming our harvest. Will Dai perhaps send down drought upon us? Will Di perhaps bring an end to this city? Dai was the high power, and the inscriptions ask constantly what he intends. But Dai received no offerings. He was too remote to bargain with. The offerings went to the royal ancestors, and to nature powers like the Yellow River, who could be reached and who could be asked to intercede. So, the same archive that asks whether the rain is coming also records what was paid to move it. Shall we sacrifice 100 Chang people to High King Tang, to the great ancestors Jian and Ding, and to Grandfather Yi? Shall we sacrifice 2 elders of the Qiang tribe to Grandfather Ding and Father Jia? The Qiang were pastoralists living west of the Shang, and they were the main supply. Counting the sacrificial inscriptions, the historian Huang Jianyu arrived at 13,052 human victims recorded in the archive, of whom at least 7,426 were Qiang. Under one king, Wu Ding, the recorded total passes 9,000. The ground agrees with the archive. In the eastern wing of the royal cemetery at Shibegang, there are over 2,500 sacrificial pits holding humans, animals, and chariots. More than 1,300 have been excavated. Around 900 contain nothing but people, and the individuals in them number at least 3,460. Some pits hold bodies without heads. Others hold heads without bodies. 10 or so to a pit is typical, and they were often laid in alongside cattle, sheep, and pigs in the same fill by the same procedure. And then the isotopes came back, and the timescale changed. In 2017, Christina Chung, working with Jichun Jing, Jigen Tang, Darlene Weston, and Michael Richards, measured carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur in the bones of 68 sacrificial victims, and compared them with 39 ordinary residents of the same city. Every one of the 47 individuals who could be sexed was male, or probably male. They had died between 15 and 50, most of them as young adults. The sulfur said they had not grown up at Anyang. The carbon and nitrogen said that by the time they died, they were eating what everyone else in the city ate, with far less animal protein in it. Millet mostly, not much else. That combination has one implication, and it is a haunting one. Reading the inscriptions alone, scholars had estimated that captives were killed within about 8 days of arriving. The bone chemistry says they were held for years, long enough for their own tissue to rewrite itself around the diet of the place where they were going to die. So the machinery looks like this. A king asks whether the high god intends drought. The cracks are red, an offering is specified. Men captured on a campaign in the west, who have been living in the city on millet ever since, are brought out and killed in tens, and their heads are buried apart from their bodies, close to the tombs of the ancestors being asked to intervene. The queries survive in their thousands, with the answers written next to them. We know the names of the kings who asked, the ancestors they addressed, the diviners who read the cracks, and the exact number of people handed over. Who were the 13,000? The archive that counted them did not record a single one of their names. Number 6. The beaded burial at Cahokia. Melvin Fowler began cutting into Mound 72 in 1967 on the floodplain east of what is now St. Louis. By 1971, he had taken apart a low, ridge-topped mound about 43 meters long. Inside it were more than 250 people, buried in at least 6 separate episodes. Cahokia in its prime was the largest settlement north of Mexico, and it arrived with startling speed. Estimates put the village that preceded it at 1,500 to under 3,000 people, and the city that replaced it, in the 50 years after AD 1050, at 10 to 15,000. Plazas, a grid, an earthen pyramid 30 meters high, and a population with no precedent anywhere nearby. At the center of Mound 72 was the deposit that made the site famous. 2 bodies, laid one above the other. With them were more than 20,000 beads cut from marine shell, hauled up from the Gulf of Mexico. Somebody had counted them out. Around them, in the same mound, were the pits. A grave holding 53 young women, laid out in 2 layers, separated by matting. Another with 19 probable women and more than 35,000 shell beads. And a group of 4 adult men with their elbows linked, whose heads and hands had been removed. For 40 years, this was read one way: a dead king, a warrior aristocracy, a cult of a birdman hero. Retainers and captives killed to accompany a great man into the ground, and a cape of beads shaped like a falcon laid across his body. It was a good story. It was repeated everywhere. What makes this entry unlike the others is that the evidence was reread and the story fell apart. In 2016, Thomas Emerson, Kristen Hedman, and Eve Hargrave, with Don Cobb and Andrew Thompson, published a reanalysis in American Antiquity. The 2 central individuals were not 2 men. One of them was a woman. The central feature did not contain 6 people. It contained at least 12, including further male and female pairs, and a child of about 5. Of 23 individuals in that part of the mound, roughly 10 were women, and the beads were not laid out as a falcon. The arrangement is irregular, in multiple deposits. The cape everybody had pictured is not in the ground. Their reading is that this was never a chief's funeral. It was a rite about creation and renewal, with a paired man and woman at the center of it, performed at the moment a city was being invented. The strontium in the teeth had already dismantled the other half of the old story. In a 2015 study, Andrew Thompson, Kristen Hedman, and Philip Slater found that about 91% of the individuals they sampled fell inside the local range. The young women in the mass graves were not foreign tribute. They were not captured brides. They came from the floodplain, and as far as the chemistry can say, they were the city's own daughters. Only one group showed a narrow signature from somewhere else, and that is the group with clear evidence of violent death. They may be the war captives everybody had assumed the rest were. There is a chronological wrinkle worth keeping. Radiocarbon from the central feature has been reported at around AD 991 to 1023, which would put this burial slightly before the explosion of building rather than after it. If that holds, the rite came first, and the city followed, which is an extraordinary thing to have to consider. Cahokia was largely empty by about AD 1350. The proposed causes are a return of Mississippi flooding after 1200, severe drought, deforestation, political failure, and every combination of those, and each has a published rebuttal. What did not happen is the thing the word collapse implies. The region was reoccupied within a century and a half, and the descendants of the people who built that mound are still here. The mound was rebuilt over its own graves, then flattened by a plow. Everything anyone knows about it comes from a 4-year excavation, and the most confident thing said about it for 2 generations turned out to be wrong. Number 5. The children carried up the volcanoes. In February 1999, Johann Reinhard and Constanza Cerruti reached a stone platform on the summit ridge of Lulayaco, a volcano on the border between Argentina and Chile, at over 6,700 meters. It is the highest archaeological site in the world. Buried below the platform were 3 children, a girl of about 13, and a boy, and a girl aged 4 or 5. They are among the best preserved human bodies ever recovered. Frozen for 5 centuries, at an altitude where nothing rots, they still have skin, hair, eyelashes, internal organs, and the contents of their stomachs. Around them lay gold and shell figurines, wool slings, a white feather headdress, leather shoes, and textiles. More than 100 Inca sites are known above 5,200 meters, some of them close to 6,700, across Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Nearly all were built inside about 60 years, between 1470 and 1532. This was a state program, and it had a name: Cahokia. The Spanish chroniclers recorded why it was performed, and the list is specific. The accession of a new emperor, his illness or his death, or the birth of a son, a victorious return from war, the consecration of a temple, and natural disaster, drought, epidemic, earthquake, volcanic eruption, the failure of the weather the crops depended on. Molina wrote that towns across the empire had to send 1 or 2 children of about 10 to the capital, along with fine cloth, llamas, and figurines. Hernandez Principe recorded one case in detail. A girl called Tanta Carhua, from Ocros, 10 years old, taken up a mountain. Her selection raised her father into local office. The truly disturbing part is the year that came before. In 2013, Andrew Wilson of the University of Bradford published an analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that read the older girl's hair as a chemical diary. Hers was 28 centimeters long, which is more than 2 years of record. Segment by segment, the team measured the breakdown product of coca and the markers of alcohol. About 12 months before she died, everything changes at once. Her diet shifts from the food of a highland peasant to the food of an elite, with more protein and more maize in it, and sustained coca chewing starts in the same window. That is almost certainly the moment she was chosen. 6 months before the end, her hair was cut, and the cut hair was placed in a pouch that traveled with her to the summit. Ancient DNA confirmed it was hers. In the final 3 months, the isotopes change again, tracking water and stored maize from higher ground. That is the pilgrimage. In the last 6 to 8 weeks, the alcohol markers peak, alongside the coca. The braiding in her hair was done in her final days. The 2 smaller children show far lower levels of both. They were not treated the same way. She was also seriously ill. In 2012, a separate team ran protein analysis on swabs taken from her lips and found immune proteins indicating an active bacterial lung infection, along with DNA from the tuberculosis group of bacteria. The scans agreed, with a shadow in her right upper lobe and inflammation in her sinuses. The little boy buried a few meters away had none of it. How the 3 of them died is not established, and that needs saying plainly. None of the Lulailaco children shows any injury at all. Cold or suffocation before burial, or being placed in the tomb alive, are inferences. Elsewhere, the trauma is unmistakable. The girl from Novato Ampato in Peru was found in 1995, at around 6,300 meters. She was killed by a blow to the head. It fractured her right eye socket and split her skull over 5 centimeters, and it was confirmed on a scan at Johns Hopkins in 1996. And the mountain that took her is the reason anyone found her. Ampato sits beside Sabancaya, which reawakened in the 1990s and dropped hot ash across the ice cap. Dark ash absorbed sunlight. The ice melted, and the bundle slid out of the place it had been put 550 years earlier. 8 or more children were recovered from inside the crater of Misty, at about 5,700 meters. The chronicler Marua recorded that in Inca times an eruption of Misty devastated the people, and the offerings in that crater are usually red as the answer to it. No dating evidence connects the two. The volcano is still active. It stands less than 20 kilometers from a city of more than 1 million people. Number 4. Huanchaquito. Gabriel Prieto went to a low patch of ground behind the beach at Huanchaquito, north of Trujillo in Peru, expecting a Chimú fishing settlement. He and the osteologist John Verano worked the site from 2011 to 2016 and published it in 2019. Out of 700 square meters of sand came 140 people, 137 of them children, and more than 200 llamas. The children were 5 to 14 years old, most of them between 8 and 12, both sexes. They had been wrapped in plain cotton shrouds. Some had their faces painted with a red cinnabar pigment. Some wore distinctive cotton headdresses. The llamas were young, 3/4 of them under 9 months. Nearly every child whose chest survived intact has a single clean cut straight across the breastbone. The llamas carry the same cut, in the same place, on their sternums and ribs. That means the chest was opened transversely, in one stroke, in an animal and in a child, by somebody who had done it before. The excavators are careful in print. The purpose of opening the chests can only be hypothesized, they write, but removal of the heart is a likely motivation. The children were laid facing west, toward the sea. The llamas faced the mountains. 20 radiocarbon dates from 2 independent laboratories put all of it between AD 1400 and 1450. No burial cuts another, and the whole assemblage sits in a single layer of clean sand. This was one event, but here's where the ground itself becomes a witness. Above the sand lay a surface of dried mud, and the mud had been walked on while it was still wet. Preserved in it are the sandal prints of adults, the smaller bare footprints of children, the two-toed prints of camelids, and the prints of dogs. An aerial photograph from 1942 shows at least 2 erosional channels running down from the bluff above the site, cut by water, in a place where it does not rain. The Chimú state ran the north coast of Peru for something like 5 centuries, from a capital at Chichén that was among the largest cities in the pre-Hispanic Americas. It ran on canals, irrigation systems crossing whole valleys, feeding fields in one of the driest deserts on Earth. That apparatus has a single predictable enemy. Every so often, the eastern Pacific warms, and torrential rain falls on a coast built for none of it, drowning the fields and taking out the canals. So the reading writes itself, and this is precisely where the authors refuse to run. The correlation between heavy rain and the sacrifice may be coincidental, they write. It is tempting to hypothesize that the two are associated. No independent climate record dates a particular event to that year. The mud proves only that it had recently rained hard on a coast where hard rain is a catastrophe. There is more of it nearby. At Pampa La Cruz, a couple of kilometers away, the same team has documented 6 separate sacrificial events across roughly 4 centuries, dated by 80 radiocarbon measurements. They run from the Chimú period into the years of Inca rule. Several hundred children in total, across the 2 sites. One group excavated in 2022 had been laid out on an artificial mound beside irrigation works, feet pointing east, and Prieto's reading of that one is different. An offering to energize the fields, which changes the horrifying arithmetic slightly, and does not improve it. Huanchaquito is the largest single-mass child sacrifice known anywhere in the archaeological record, but it was not a one-off spasm of terror. It was the largest instance of a thing this state did repeatedly, over generations, in an orderly fashion, with specialists. The last physical act of 140 people is preserved in that mud. They walked in. Number 3. The boys beneath Chichén Itzá. In 1967, a construction crew cutting a new airstrip near the Great Pyramid at Chichén Itzá broke into a chultun. It is a bell-shaped cistern hollowed out of the limestone, 300 meters northeast of the sacred cenote. It was not a water tank anymore. Attached to it was a small natural cave. Inside were the bones of at least 106 infants and young children. They sat in storage for more than 50 years. Then, in June 2024, a team led by Rodrigo Barquera at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published 64 whole genomes from that chamber in Nature. To avoid sampling anyone twice, they used only left ear bones. 26 radiocarbon dates spread the deposit across 5 centuries, from the 7th into the middle of the 12th, with the heaviest use around AD 800 to 1000. Half the children were 3 to 6 years old. None had reached adulthood. All 64 were boys. That result on its own kills a story that had survived for a century, because everything written about this place, since the Spanish Chronicles, is a story about girls. It was already dead in the bone. Edward Thompson dredged the sacred cenote itself between 1904 and 1910, and the remains he brought up have been reanalyzed since. They run to roughly twice as many children as adults, and among the individuals whose sex could be determined, there were more males than females. Then the genomes did something nobody had predicted. 16 of the 64 boys, a quarter of them, were closely related to another child in the chamber. 9 of those were pairs of close relatives, mostly brothers. 2 of them were pairs of identical twins. The dietary isotopes of related children cluster together, which suggests they were raised in the same households and fed the same food. So this was not a levy of anonymous children gathered from wherever. Somebody was choosing brothers, deliberately, across centuries. And twice, in a sample of 64, they chose twins. Twins are not incidental in Maya religion. In the Popol Vuh, a pair of brothers is defeated in a ball game in the underworld and sacrificed there, and one of their severed heads fathers the hero twins who avenge them. The authors of the 2024 paper make that connection explicitly. It remains an interpretation. What is not an interpretation is that the selection was targeting the relationship, not just the child. How they died is unknown. There are no cut marks and no trauma on any of them. That is a real limit, and it separates this chamber from the cenote 300 meters away. Those bones do carry cuts, dismemberment, and burning, and the isotopes show victims arriving from several regions of Mesoamerica. The boys in the Chultun were local. The rain god Chak is the obvious context, and the drought record is genuinely disturbing. Sediment from Lake Chichén Itzá shows the interval around AD 800 to 1000 as the driest of the middle to late Holocene. A stalagmite from Yok Balam Cave in Belize resolves a drying trend from AD 660 onward, and a 2018 study in Science reconstructed rainfall from water trapped inside gypsum crystals, putting the shortfall at 41 to 54%, with excursions up to 70%. The honest position is that the 2024 paper does not test that. It mentions chalk once as a possibility and runs no comparison between its own dates and any climate record. A deposit that accumulated over 500 years covers wet centuries as well as dry ones. The last part of that paper reaches forward. The team also sequenced 68 people living today in Tixcacaltuyub, a Maya town in Yucatan, and found direct genetic continuity with the children in the chamber. Then they compared immune genes across the 11 centuries between them. 8 had shifted significantly in frequency. One of the risers belongs to a group associated with resistance to enteric fever caused by salmonella, and a strain of exactly that bacterium was identified in 2018 in a mass grave from the epidemic that swept Mexico in 1545. The paper is careful, and so is this. The pattern is consistent with selection by colonial epidemics. It is not proof of it, but the shape of the thing is clear enough. For 500 years, boys were taken from local families and put into a cistern beside a sacred well, in pairs where possible, in a landscape where the rain was failing. Their relatives outlived them by 8 centuries, then survived something else. And that second survival is written into the immune systems of people who are alive right now and can tell you the name of their town. Number 2, the sacrifice the earthquake interrupted. Yannis Sakalarakis and Effie Sapuna Sakalaraki started digging at Anemospilia in 1979 on the north slope of Mount Euctus, a few kilometers south of Knossos on Crete. What they uncovered was a building unlike anything else on the island. 3 rectangular rooms in a row, fronted by a long corridor. It came down in a single event around 1700 BC, at the same horizon that ended the first palaces at Knossos and Paistos. Under the collapsed masonry were 4 people. One of them lay on a low platform in the west room. Male, about 18 years old, 1.65 meters tall. He was curled on his right side, with one leg bent back so sharply that the heel almost touched the back of the thigh. On the platform with him was a bronze blade 40 centimeters long, weighing over 450 grams, incised on both faces with an animal head. The snout and tusks of a boar, ears like butterfly wings, slanting eyes. The excavators reported one further observation about his skeleton. The bones on his upper left side were white. The bones on his lower right side were black. They read that as fire acting on a body from which the blood had already been drained. The other 3 had been caught where they stood. A man in his late 30s, 1.83 meters and heavily built, on his back beside the platform, with his hands raised toward his face, both legs broken by falling stone. He wore a ring of silver and iron. A woman of about 28, face down in the southwest corner, and a 4th person in the corridor, crushed so badly that neither age nor sex can be recovered. Beside that body lay 105 joining fragments of a bucket-shaped vessel with a bull modeled in relief, of a type used for pouring liquid offerings. The picture the excavators drew from that floor is the one the site is famous for: a ritual killing in progress, in a building already shaking apart, performed to stop the thing that was happening, and finished by it. The genuinely unsettling part is that the alternative readings are strong. Dennis Hughes made the skeptical case in a monograph in 1991. The platform is a low structure of loose stones with nothing to show it was ever an altar. The blade is a spearhead with 2 slots for mounting it on a shaft, and it may simply have fallen onto the body as the roof came in. Only one leg was flexed. The hands were not bound. The color difference in the bones is what uneven burning produces when part of a body is against the ground and part of it is next to something flammable. In 2016, Sylvie Muller-Chelka published The Strongest Alternative. On her reading, the West Room was where the dead were prepared. The young man was already dead when he was laid out, and his position, crouched on his right side, is standard for a Middle Minoan burial. The decorated spearhead, the ring, and the seal are grave goods. The platform is the size of a burial container. The earthquake is an inference too. There is no fault trace, no geological study, no seismic evidence tying this building to a specific event. What exists is collapsed masonry, broken legs, ash on the floors, and the fact that other buildings on Crete fell at about the same time. In 2017, a volume of geologists and archaeologists spent 400 pages warning the field against using earthquakes as a cause of last resort, and it lists this destruction as probable rather than proven. The eruption of Thera, which everybody reaches for, happened between the early 17th and the mid-16th century BC. That is at least 90 years after this floor was buried. One clean fact sits underneath all of it. Higher up the same mountain is the peak sanctuary of Yuctas, excavated over 16 years. Its stepped altar stands on the lip of a natural chasm, dug out to 10.5 meters without anyone reaching the bottom. It is full of ash and burnt offerings, terracotta figurines, model limbs, bronze double axes, stone libation tables, animal bone in quantity. In more than a century of work on that mountain, no human remains have ever come out of it. So the most famous human sacrifice in the Aegean rests on one building, one floor, one body, and one afternoon in the 18th century BC. 4 people died in that room when the roof came down. 3 of them are simply dead. The argument is about the 4th, and it has run for 45 years. The boy on the platform has never been re-examined by an independent team of osteologists. Number 1. The New Fire. There is a hill in the southeast of Mexico City, 225 meters high, with a road up it and a view across one of the largest cities on Earth. The Mexica called it Huanchaquito. Once every 52 years, the world was expected to end on top of it. The arithmetic behind that belief is exact, and it is the reason this entry is last. The Mexica ran 2 calendars at once, a solar year of 365 days and a ritual count of 260. Any given pairing of names from the two systems returns only after 18,980 days, which is 52 solar years. Sahagun's informants were explicit. They considered it a matter of belief, he wrote, that the world would come to an end at the conclusion of one of these bundles of years. Not might end. Was scheduled to. Everything else on this list answers something that had already gone wrong. A drought, a plague, a siege, an eruption. This one had a date on it, known decades in advance, arriving on time whether anything was wrong or not. The procedure is described in the 16th century sources, and it is total. Every fire in the empire was put out. Hearthstones were thrown away, cooking pots broken, houses swept. Then the priests walked out of Tenochtitlan to the top of the hill and waited for midnight, when the star group they used as a marker reached its high point. A captive was stretched out. His chest was opened with a flint knife, and the fire drill was worked in the cavity until it caught. Book 7 of the Florentine Codex puts it plainly. In his breast the new fire was drawn. Runners took it down the hill on pine torches to the Templo Mayor first and then outward across the lake. Every hearth in every house was relit from that one flame. The rite is not only a text. Christina Elson and Michael Smith published archaeological deposits from New Fire ceremonies in 2001 from 3 sites in central Mexico, and their conclusion matters. The ceremony was older and more widespread than the empire, and the empire took it over. At least 8 stone sculptures survive, carved as bound bundles of years, and one of them, from Iztapalapa, and older than the Aztec state, is dated 11 Reed, rather than the 2 Reed the imperial version insisted on. The schedule had once been local. The last ceremony was held in the year 2 Reed, 1507, under Moctezuma II. That one is recorded 4 separate times. In a pictorial manuscript, on a greenstone fire serpent that pairs his name glyph with the date, on a cliff relief at Chapultepec, and on a temple sculpture. 4 independent records for one night. But here's where the fire and the knife have to be tied to something measurable, because the written sources are colonial, and every one of them has an agenda. Jimena Chavez Balderas studied the human remains recovered from the Templo Mayor itself. Over 1,000 individuals are in that collection, and 74 were examined in detail. She found decapitation performed between the 5th and 6th vertebrae of the neck and established that the decapitation was not the cause of death. In one offering containing an infant, marks showed the chest had been entered from below the diaphragm, with cuts on the inner surfaces of the ribs where the arteries were severed. These people knew anatomy. And in 2015, in a building lot on Calle Guatemala, a few meters from the Templo Mayor, urban archaeologists, led by Raul Barrera Rodriguez, found a tower built out of human skulls, mortared together into a cylinder. 603 had been registered by the end of 2020. They are men, women, and children, which contradicts an assumption held for a century. A rack of skulls was supposed to be a rack of warriors. The scale has been argued over for 500 years, and the honest range is wide. 2 16th century sources claim 80,400 victims at the dedication of the Great Temple in 1487. A demographer working out how long it physically takes to kill a person put the ceiling for that event nearer 14,000. Cortez, who had every reason to inflate the figure, wrote only that 3,000 or 4,000 souls were sacrificed in a year. Current estimates start in the low thousands. Both sides had reasons to lie, and one side lost. What the Mexica thought they were doing is better documented than what they did. In their account of the beginning of the present age, the gods gathered in the dark at Teotihuacan. One of them, the poorest and most disfigured, threw himself into a fire so that the sun would move, and the rest gave themselves up after him. Everything alive afterwards was in debt for it. The word usually translated as debt payment is a poor translation, and the offering it names covered paper, copal, rubber, quail, and the blood people drew from their own ears and tongues, as well as hearts. It did not mean that a knife made the sun come up. It meant that existence had been paid for once and had to be maintained. 14 years after that last fire was lit, on the 13th of August, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The bundle of years that belonged to would not have closed until 1559. It is tempting to put those two dates side by side and hand the Mexica a prophecy. That should be resisted. No Nahuatl source records anybody doing that arithmetic. The famous omens that supposedly preceded the Spanish, the comet and the burning temple, and the woman weeping in the streets, appear in one text compiled half a century afterwards by men trained in a Franciscan library. Historians read them as a retrospective explanation written by the defeated. The most disturbing available ending is the one the evidence will not carry. What is there is the machinery, a calendar that could not be argued with, a hill outside the city, a captive chosen in advance, and the basin you can see from the top of that hill, holding more than 20 million people now, where every household fire was once put out on the same night and relit from a flame drawn in a dying man's chest. The fire was never lit again. The sun came up anyway. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.